Hello everyone! Today we're going to be talking about Fabula Ultima, a tabletop RPG that came out in the last few years that I have absolutely fallen in love with. Today I'm going to be talking about the system and kind of giving you a general how to play on it. I'm not going to be going too into detail as I do want you to go out and support the system and, purchase the books. A very important note is that as of writing this script, there are 3 books currently out for Fabula Ultima that are known as Atlases. If in the time of writing and releasing the video or after posting the next book comes out, maybe I'll do a standalone video about that, but that'll be when that happens. So, with that said, let's begin. Fabula Ultima, a name that I'm likely butchering the pronunciation of. What is it though? Well, it's a tabletop RPG that looks to emulate the feeling of JRPGs. Games like Final Fantasy, Bravely Default, Etrian Odyssey, and other amazing games that people have enjoyed for years. It's also a game that prioritizes storytelling, and combat's not really the central focus, which I'll go into when I get more to the combat section. The main mechanic of no, with the sniffle. Fabula Ultima, a name that I'm likely butchering the pronunciation of. What is Fabula Ultima? Well, it's a tabletop RPG that looks to emulate the feeling of JRPGs. Games like Final Fantasy, Bravely Default, Etrian Odyssey, and other amazing games that people like myself have enjoyed for many years. It is also a game that prioritizes storytelling, and combat isn't really a central focus of it, but it does matter to the game. I'm going to go more into that when I get to the combat section later. The main mechanic of Fabula Ultima is the Fabula point system. Each player starts the game with 3 Fabula points, and they can gain these as the game goes on in the following ways. If a player starts a session with 0 points, they immediately gain 1. If a player fumbles, they gain a point. A character that is reduced to 0 hit points and surrenders immediately gains 2 hit points. And whenever a villain enters onto the scene, the players all gain a Fabula point. Finally, whenever a player invokes a bond or a trait to automatically fail a check or an action, they will also gain a point. These can be used in a couple of different ways. Players can invoke traits and spend a Fabula point to re-roll a check if it's relevant to their trait. For example, if a character's home is labeled as the Kingdom of Eindir and they're attempting to sabotage a magic ritual that endangers their home kingdom, they can spend a Fabula point and re-roll whatever their dice show to hopefully get a better result. However, they do keep whatever that second result is. A character can also spend a Fabula point and invoke their bonds, which I'll go into detail on bonds later, but when they do, they get a bonus to rolls relevant to this bond, the bonus being equivalent to their bond score. I will discuss traits more as I get to the character creation section, but for a brief overview on bonds, what they are is that they are a breakdown of the different kind of relationships a character might have. Any player can have up to a bond level of 3, where the bond can either be admiration or inferiority, loyalty or mistrust, affection or hatred. A character can't have a bond of admiration and inferiority, but they can have admiration and mistrust. Maybe they look up to this character, but it's someone that they don't see as a hero to themselves. Now, that is a very important thing. Characters don't really start with a bond, but they will get them as the story goes on. Some skills will also utilize these Fabula points, such as the Orator skill, My Trust in You, which allows you to spend the Fabula point for an ally to invoke their traits or bonds. The final use of a Fabula point is to alter the story in mostly minor ways. It's important to know that the alteration can't be something excessively major or something that influences a check necessarily. So, something like the villain is actually a good natured person, or something saying, like, oh, this check actually will hit the enemy. Those aren't things you use the Fabula points for. You can use it to reroll your check to maybe hit the enemy, but you can't just spend the point and say it. A couple of examples of things you can do for altering the story. Character's ducking into a back alley and wants to spend a Fabula point so that a ladder happens to have been left behind and they can scale a wall nearby. Or maybe as they're hiding, a random NPC happens to be on the scene that they have a relationship with. No matter what change you decide, however, it is important to know that the GM has the final say and is able to deny the use of that. If they do so, you still get to keep your Fabula point, you just don't get the effect. Attributes in Fabula are rated in die size. There are 4 attributes that make up the entire system. These are might, dexterity, insight, and willpower. Might determines your strength, HP, as well as your endurance. Dexterity determines your evasion, precision, as well as your motor function. Insight represents your ability to perceive or read people's intentions, and willpower is your ability to resist influence, as well as your ability to cast spells. From here, any skills being rolled all utilize these attributes in combinations of 2. You can combine the same attribute if needed, such as if a character's shoving a cart, they can just roll their might twice and add those together. This is one area I'd have loved to have been expanded just a little bit. It's a little bit limited, and some roles are a bit difficult. Knowledge checks don't really have an outlet, as it's a bit hard to really come up with. I just generally use double insight, if not insight and willpower. Whereas, charisma also is noticeably absent. I like not having an attribute that does determine how attractive or well spoken a character can be, as it leaves it more to the player's imagination and decisions. But I also have seen in the past where a player isn't as sure what to say to a character, so they'll rely on their persuasion roll or their deception rolls, something that doesn't really exist in Fabula. Something I do suggest at times as a GM is you can allow players to roll something that isn't normally applicable. If a fighter is in a ballroom and trying to make a good impression, maybe they can tell war stories, and utilizing their attack skills, they can give more grandiose or flourish to the story they tell and maybe build up some more relationship. This is just something I suggest. It's not something you have to do, but it does expand things like a social interaction. Group roles are a mechanic I really love how Fabula Ultima handles. When doing group roles, the participating members elect a leader to the role. This player will ultimately be determining if this is a successful or failed role, but just always let your players know what they'll be rolling so they can make an informed decision. Then, what happens is the players who aren't the leader, they will roll a check of their own with a difficulty of 10. So as long as their dice beat a 10, they will succeed, and they give the leader a +1. Of the supporting players that succeed, if any of them has a bond with the leader, whoever has the highest bond with the leader gets to add theirs. So they'll get +1 for succeeding, and if one of those successes has a bond, they can give like a +1 if that bond is only a 1 bond. The leader will then roll their dice, giving the bonuses they got from their allies, as well as any miscellaneous bonuses, and then from there they treat it normally, influencing it with traits and bonds and criticals as normal. Criticals I will discuss later because it just feels a little bit more appropriate. Another thing that I love is inventory management has been vastly simplified. Characters begin with 6 inventory points, though some classes bolster this, allowing players to have more. Character can never exceed their maximum inventory points cost, and players will spend inventory points for basic gear, things like potions. A healing potion or a mind potion both cost 3 inventory points and heal 50 of their respective pools. A tonic, which removes a single status effect, costs 2 inventory points. Elemental shards, which cost 2, can deal 10 points of damage of specific elemental varieties. The most important tool that a player can pull out is the magical tent. What this does is when the players are out in the wilderness, they're able to create a safe sleeping space for 4 inventory points. This is arguably the most important item in their inventory because it makes it so they can't even be attacked while resting. Now, you aren't supposed to allow players to split costs of any of these items because it's supposed to be every character's provisions. I ignore that rule specifically for the magical tent. I think that allowing players to each spend 1 point can kind of allow them to go on longer journeys without having to worry as much about, well, you know, all of us have spent 4 points. We've been out for 4 nights. Now each of us only has 2 points. We no longer have a tent and we're still a week out from town. That's something to consider, and you can kind of avoid that. Miscellaneous items such as rope and lockpicks, those have a cost based on the game master, kind of influenced by what the character is. A thief having lockpicks makes sense, and you can just kind of hand wave a cost on that. But if, an upright holy knight wants to pull out lockpicks, that might cost them a point or two because that's not something they would commonly carry. Now, Fabula is a group storytelling game, more so than many other tabletop RPGs I've played. It stresses for the group to discuss the world, the villain, the story, and even some class abilities together, though I suggest letting the player have the final say on that. Because of this, there's not a world present in the core book per se. The kind of world you want to build can be influenced by which supplemental book you're using, and there are basic suggestions for them in the core book. The 3 different types of worlds they suggest are broken down into the high fantasy world, which is a world of magic and monsters. Things like hope and fighting together are a central aspect. Natural fantasy, which is worlds of warmth and community where nature is a center to a lot of what's present, and techno fantasy, which is arguably darker and more serious than the other two, with themes of hopelessness and ruthlessness. Definitely, this is something to talk about as a group. This can highly influence the characters you build, and supplemental books expanding on the high fantasy and techno fantasy currently that include even things like examples, locations for players to visit. What I suggest, once you've decided which of these settings you want to do, for the game masters to make a couple of map designs, if not do so as a group, and decide which map you want to use. Don't put in towns and kingdoms and all that, just general terrains, deserts, forests, grassland, maybe some borders to fill in, and then let the players start coming up with those locations and then fill in the rest from there. I suggest this because, like I did for Fabulous Misfits and many other games before, it can give a lot of interesting territories, and your players are going to have a lot more information that connects them to those areas. I've done this in most of my games where I would tell my players, hey, if you have a kingdom you want and nothing that I've designed fits your needs, let me know. We'll work something up together, or you can even just give me documents and I will throw it up. And I've never had a problem with this. But in Fabula Ultima, it felt natural, as, again, it's something that even the book suggests you do. The campaign is also suggested to be discussed as a group. Players don't need to know every little thing about the enemies, but they should have a general idea of who or what the villain is trying to accomplish or what their goals are. This could be as simple as deciding on a villain, an organization, maybe even just a theme for the villain to get an idea for what the players want to do. Give the players an idea of what they stand for and against. This way, when they're building their characters, they can plan that out. If the players determine, for example, that their villain is going to be General Ragston of the Empire Garand, that doesn't mean they know all of Ragston's underlings, nor do they even know if Garand actually is in full support of the general. And this is kind of an area I think players should have less influence, just so that you can keep them on their toes during the game. You actually might have seen that on Fabulous Misfits episode 7. There is a moment where the players finally do come to face with the villain and some of the underlings. And while we agreed on a general theme for the villain, we never confirmed the details about the villain, and you can see that they weren't as expectant. The final thing the group really decides together is how the group comes together. The book has examples, but realistically, even beyond what the book shows, there are infinite possibilities, and it helps when players know each other from the get-go, but there are times when the group may want to meet during the first session. It's important to make sure that there is a reason for the group to stay together, because without that reason, a character could just walk away, and it becomes a little bit tougher. As a GM, you are supposed to give them hooks, and as a player, it's also important to make sure that you're grabbing onto those hooks if you can find any reason to. I do, however, suggest avoiding the Guardians group. The Guardians group has one player who is designated as a chosen one, and the rest of the group are their guards or their support. And well-experienced game masters, and maybe even some newer game masters, will immediately notice one, if not two, problems with this group style. First off, it can create main character syndrome, where that chosen one player is more important. That chosen one player determines so much of the campaign, and it can start to make the other players feel less important, and it can make that main character feel, well, like a main character. The other reason I suggest, and this is something I've had personal issues with in the past with multiple campaigns I've run, if you have a chosen one character that's kind of in charge of everything, and that character has to drop, you're either going to have to pivot hard on the storyline, or you're gonna lose the campaign. And it's not fun or ideal. The book mentions that the Brought Together by Fate group is difficult as well, since that is one where the group did not know each other at the start, but is given a common goal, and that basically the group will be swapping from Brought Together by Fate to one of the other groups. However, realistically, the group dynamic is kind of explaining why they get together or how they got together, and doesn't give them mechanical benefits later on in the campaign. So if you do this, just be prepared to try and come up with that common goal for your party. Your characters are the heroes and protagonists of the story and world. They're destined for greatness, but who are you really? What do you stand for? Where are you from? These are all important things to know as a character. Character will have 3 traits to fill out at the start, and this is where the book says to start building your character. First off, they want you to choose an identity of who are you? An identity is kind of a short backstory describing who you are. You don't want to make it too specific, but you also don't want to be too general. Book has a few great examples, as you can see here, such as the Battle Priestess of the Old Faith, Queen of the Desert Thieves, or former Imperial Strategist. So, God, there's a lot of backstory to each of those, and something worth considering when choosing your identity. Next up is the theme of your character. What dominates your character's actions? Think of characters from shows you know. Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z is motivated by his pride. Edward Elric from Fullmetal Alchemist is motivated by his guilt. Or even Light Yagami from Death Note motivated by ambition. Sure, these characters are all much more than just single word motivations, but it doesn't change that these are so core to those characters that if you took away these things, the story would begin to fall apart. Without Ed's guilt over his brother, he would not have gotten to the point of fighting pride or, greed or wrath or any of them. Without Vegeta's pride, he would never have stood up to Beerus or Frieza. Your character's the same. You might be on the adventure because you want to find a family of your own, those around you that won't judge you for mistakes, or powers that feel evil or are even sourced from evil. Your theme is belonging. You might wish to help those in need no matter what they've done in their past. Your theme is mercy or even hope. Maybe you question that which you've been taught and have broken off from an evil empire. Now you work to defeat them, but at the end of the day, you don't know if they're actually evil or if they're doing what is important to be done. And at that point, your theme is doubt. With a single word, you can hint such a large story. The third trait is your origin, where you're from. This is why I suggest doing world building and having the players involved so much. When players put more work into their origin, there's going to be so much for you to pull from when those players are interacting with their or invoking their traits. It's almost impressive to see what players will do when they have that connection to their homes. So, you've got the who of your character, but what about the what? What skills do they know? Are they spellcasters? Are they sword fighters? Well, you get 5 levels at the start of your campaign, and you can divide them among 2 or 3 classes that you get to choose. Whenever you spend the first level in a class, you get the free benefits, which is just going to be located on the page. You get them at the level 1 of that class. However, let's say you have 3 classes, you'll get the free benefits of all 3 once. If you only have 2, you'll get free benefits of 2 of them. You then, as you spend the levels in those classes, you get to pick a skill listed for that class. Some of the skills can only be bought once, but some will have a cross with a number on the same line as its name, which means that you can buy that skill that many times. For example, the Arcane Circle ability of the Arcanist can be bought up to 4 times, which allows you to cast a spell for free when dismissing your Arcanum, as long as it's a mind point cost less than 5 times your Arcane Circle level. Your starting classes are meant to be divided between 2 or 3 classes, but if a player is passionate enough about starting with only a single class, I would say let them. They are only going to be hindering themselves at that point, and it's part of storytelling. There are classic characters listed which allow you to create classes from well-known RPGs, things like the Red Mage, the Ninja, the Alchemist. If you just take a look, it'll tell you where to spend your skill points and even what items you might want to start with. After determining our classes, we determine our attributes. You have quite a few options for how to spend them. There's 3 in the book for player characters, and I have my own little funny names for them. We have the Oops All D8s, where you have a D8 in all 4 of your attributes. We have the Specialist, where you get 1d10, 1d6, and 2d8 to put in your attributes. Then we have the All-In, where you put 2d10 into 2 of your attributes, and then you put 2d6 into your attributes. Keep in mind that this is going to also influence your secondary stats, so this might be something to keep in mind. Your hit points are your might times 5 plus your class level. Your mind points are the same, only they use willpower instead of your might. Your attacks with weapons are going to depend on what the weapon is, where your spells are going to determine usually by insight and willpower. Your defense is going to be equal to your dexterity based off of your armor, and your magic defense is going to be equal to your insight. Initiative starts at 0, but can also be influenced by armor and shields. Which brings me to the next step. You get 500 Zenit, which is the currency of the game, to purchase your equipment. Feel free to change the name of Zenit to something that fits. In Fabulous Misfits, we have Necropolis, where they use bones. We have the Imperial Coin. There are a lot of different ways you can spin it. Just as a general thing, something that is equivalent throughout the world makes a lot of sense. So you're going to spend 500 Zenit on your equipment, which makes sure that your class allows you to purchase martial weapons and armor before you equip them, since you can only purchase what you can equip. You can do a lot of flavoring here, as the book will show basic ideas, such as it'll show the bronze sword, and when you purchase it, you can say, well, it's going to be a scimitar, or it's going to be a gladius, and that's just what it is. It doesn't change any of the stats, just lets you have the weapon you want. You might buy a silk vest and decide, well, this is going to be a kimono or a yukata. Anything you don't spend in this step, you get to keep, as well as another 2d6 multiplied by 10. You then add your 3 Fabula Ultima points. You give your character a name and pronouns, something the book even specifies, which, as a trans content creator and tabletop lover, I really enjoy, and, well, you've got a hero. Now, before we go on, I'm going to talk about an optional rule that gets added in the high fantasy book and expanded on later, and that's quirks. Quirks are optional rules that give your players a little something extra. There's ones that give flying, there's ones that give elemental resistance, there's ones that give bonuses to unarmed strikes. The books do talk about not letting players take the same quirk. Realistically, I have no issues with it. I even use quirks to influence some races that might be around the world. In Fabulous Misfits, there's the Arboreals, which create the Verdant race, which are a race of plant people. So, yeah, let your players take them, as long as players aren't clearly all taking this. Like, if all the players are taking the flying one just to ignore the fact you need a ranged weapon to attack flying ones, maybe have a discussion with them, but otherwise, I don't see an issue with letting players take the same one within reason. I personally include them in my campaigns, and as long as you and your players talk out any of the more complicated ones, I see no reason to not run them. There isn't a lot that goes into leveling, but there's enough that I am going to go into it a little bit in its own section. So in Fabula Ultima, you will be leveling up a lot. In the base rules, you get 5 experience at the end of every session. You also get an experience point for every Ultima point that the villain spends, and for every Fabula point spent by the group divided by the group number, you also get an experience point. This is rounded down. So in a group of 4, if they spend 4 points, you will get 1 experience point each, whereas if they only spend 2 or 3, they won't get any. There are some optional rules such as Blitz, Embodiment, and MVP that adjust how much experience you can get. And if you're going to use those rules, I suggest lowering how much experience you're giving at the end of each session. Blitz is where players will gain experience at the end of a battle equal to 5 minus the number of rounds the battle took. This rewards extremely fast combat and smart thinking. If the combat round only goes for 2 rounds, then players will get 3 experience at the end of it, whereas if it goes for 4, they only get 1. Embodiment has players vote for who embodied their identity and theme the best during the session. This grants 2 added experience to that player or players, as if there's a tie, all of the tied players get this. Players don't get to reward the reward twice in a row, and you aren't able to vote for yourself or your game master. There are kind of issues here where if a string of sessions happens where maybe a player's theme or identity isn't really going to be able to come up, that player may wind up getting a bit of a disparagement, and I don't suggest allowing that. There is another optional rule similar to embodiment called MVP, where instead of embodiment being who embodied their character best, MVP is just who was the most vital, who had made the biggest effect. And much like embodiment, the winner of the vote will get an extra 2 experience and has the same limits of not being able to get it twice in a row and not being able to vote for yourself or the game master. Now, the experience disparagement that can come from this, it's small at start, but it can get a bit out of hand, so that is something to keep in mind. As well as the book mentions that these can foster an unhealthy play environment, and to discuss with your group before you start using these rules, you and your group will know what's best for you better than myself or the writers of the book, as we're not directly involved with your group. So keep these things in mind. When a character levels up, there are a few things. They get a level that they get to spend in their classes. If they have less than 3 non-mastered classes, they're able to put it into a whole new class, whereas if they have only non-mastered classes and they have 3 of them, they have to level up one of their existing classes. A class is considered mastered when you've put 10 levels into it. Doing so gives you a heroic skill, which are similar to the skills you get for your classes. However, they have slightly bolstered effects because they are so much harder to get, being that they require you to spend 10 levels in a class. Some of them are specific to a class, some of them are generic, like ones that increase your hit points or your mind points. So these are something to maybe keep in mind whenever you're picking a class to see what kind of heroic skill you may want to try and get. Now, per book's rules as written, they say you can't go above level 10 in a class. Once you've mastered it, that's it. I agree on pushing characters to branch out, as learning a new class doesn't change who they are and can easily bolster their abilities. An elementalist learning the Arcanum class doesn't suddenly make them a summoner. They might have just learned a new way to pull on elemental magic and manifest it in a new form or a new way. However, I allow characters to go past level 10 as long as there are skills to be gained in that class. The downside is that that character can no longer gain heroic skills. So if a character somehow manages to reach level 20 in a class, they don't have a second heroic skill from it. They still only have the one from level 10. When a character reaches level 20, level 40, and every 20 levels after, they increase one of their attributes to the next die step to a maximum of a d12. Then a character will increase their hit points and mind points accordingly. Every level, a character increases both of those by 1, but when they increase the die size of their might and or insight, then they get a bit more of an increase. A character at level up is also able to update their identity and theme as long as it's within reason. Character whose theme is anger may have gone through internal dialogue and decisions in a character arc, and maybe instead of anger, they've decided to be merciful. Instead of lashing out, maybe they want to protect those around them. Maybe a character whose identity has been their faith to their home has been shaken, and now they're in doubt of their origins and efforts to, help. These are all great for growth, and don't be afraid to let your GM and group know that, hey, I'm going to be making changes to what my character is striving to do. There's, as I said, not a lot to leveling up, but again, I wanted to go over it so you know what to expect. Combat in Fabula Ultima is very simplified compared to a lot of other tabletops I've played, but it's in a good way. Combat starts with a group initiative roll. As explained in Chapter 1, it uses dexterity and insight. I'm going to be referring to characters as actors for the purpose of the explanation of combat, but I will try and make it as least confusing as possible. The players will roll versus the highest initiative rating of the enemies, and if they succeed, they have priority. If they fail, then the enemies will have priority. Whoever has priority gets to select one of their actors to take the first turn. After that actor has taken their turn, it swaps to the other team, who selects an actor to take their initiative turn as well. This goes back and forth until one team has utilized all of their turns, at which point the other team gets to then utilize all of their turns. So it might be player, enemy, player, enemy, player, enemy, player, player, or something along those lines if the players had the initiative. On a player's turn, the actor gets to do one single action. This can be attacking, using a spell, a skill, or an item by spending inventory points. You'll notice that movement isn't included because in this system, movement is ignored. It's assumed that with the exception of flying actors, everybody is able to reach anybody else in the scene. Flying actors do need to be hit with spells or ranged attacks and cannot be hit by melee unless by another flying actor. Nobody is ever out of melee range with the exception of flying. When an actor is attacking, they will roll an accuracy check, and if it's higher than the relevant defense, which will be determined by how they're attacking, they use the high roll of the attack and add it to their damage modifier. If Gavon rolled an 8 and a 5 to hit the Dread Urn, he would take the 8, add his plus 5 damage modifier to deal 13 damage to the urn. The damage is then influenced by vulnerabilities, resistances, immunities, or absorbing. A character that is vulnerable to damage takes double the damage. An actor who is resistant will take half the damage. An immune actor takes no damage, and an actor that has absorb restores the hit points they would have taken instead of taking that damage. Players will get theirs primarily from spells, abilities, quirks, or equipment, while actors will just have it naturally built in often. As a GM, there may come time when players are going to take damage from something unexpected, such as a collapsing bridge or building, or maybe a player decides to baseball bat a Hexeye but fails to hit, though with how close the Hexeye is and the combat's gone on so long, you ask them if they want to fail forward just to push things along. So they baseball bat this Hexeye and it slams into a nearby party member, causing a minor amount of damage. In these cases, there's a nice little table to figure out how much damage that character should take, as you can see here. It's nice and simple, and minor damage is so little when the Chimerist gets hit in the back with an urn that should have been dead 12 turns ago. Anyway, no personal struggles there. Crits, right. I was going to talk about crits. So, with crits, a character will crit whenever both dice show the same number and are 6 or higher. There are some abilities that will influence that to be any time the dice show the same number that isn't a fumble, which is double ones. So normally on a double 6, double 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, the character has critical success and gets to use an advantage. You can see the list here. These are not limited to combat, as you can see, and some even are used in social interactions or during investigations. Problem is that when a actor fumbles, they get the opposite luck, and the opposing character gets to use an advantage. If a player were to fumble, the GM gets to determine an advantage fitting for the situation. If, there's an honorable duel going on between a noble and you go for the attack, but you've nat won, the noble who has been slightly jeering at you finally manages to break your mask, and as you thrust with your blade, you yell knowing that they were, you know, the ones behind ordering your noble house to be searched, which led to you being dishonored and falling from grace and suffering on the streets. The revenge you've cultivated against them without them knowing all comes out and may jeopardize whatever you're currently going through. And it's just from a fumble. It may not be something so heavy in regards, and with something like the advantage or opportunity, it's just as simple as giving a bonus to another person. I love that you can get very creative with these, which as a GM is great for storytelling. Now, there's no experience gain from combat, as I explained during the level up chapter. The only way to get experience is through the blitz optional rule or points being spent. So don't expect there to be combat every session, and as GM, don't write combat to be every session. It certainly can be, and I know I have a lot of combat in Fabulous Misfits, but understandably, combat is not the central focus of the game. Having a lot of roleplay sessions is just as important, if not more so, for pushing the story forward. If anything, use the combat as a way to push the story forward, or at least to keep your players on track every so often when they might be getting a bit off the beaten path or just traveling for a long time to keep things interesting. As a game master, it's always your job to guide the story and control the various NPCs the players will be interacting with, including who or whatever the big bad evil is. Fabula puts a lot of tools in your belt to make the game feel alive, as well as to make the game feel very JRPG. We're going to be talking about all of them, but players, you can feel free to skip this part. This is going to be going into what GMs can use, and on one hand, keeping track of it so that it doesn't feel too gimmicky or out of left field is fine, but there's also nothing wrong with saving this part specifically for those who have that interest in being a game master. If I did it right, the chapters will show you where the next section is. Now, my personal favorite tool is where we're going to start, and that is the GM scene. This is a short scene where the camera zooms out from the players, focusing on a different area of the world. This is used often to show the villains plotting or committing their atrocities or, what have you, and they're setting a tone that can be used to steer the plot in a direction. I suggest using them sparingly. After all, considering when a villain shows up on a scene, including a GM scene, players get a Fabula point. You don't want to overuse this, as well as you don't want to zoom in on moments that are unimportant. Nobody needs to watch the big bad general eating a plate of pancakes, but him pushing a unit of untrained, unequipped rookies to a front line as a diversion could be something to watch. You'll notice in Fabulous Misfits, to the point of recording this, I've only used one GM scene so far, and that was to set up the introduction. And I'm not sure when the next one will be, but sparingly is the way to go. The next great tool, and one that I will be stealing for other tabletop games that I run, is going to be the clocks. Well, what you see here are physical representations of the clocks that are used for this system. The idea is that players are on a set time. They only have so much time to do X, Y, or Z. they need to hit so many levers or push so many buttons, commit so many steps to a ritual, and this is used to either stop some evil machination or it's to interrupt an evil machination, or maybe even creating like a barrier spell around a town. The clock is used to keep track of it. During a scene, players are able to do actions that will fill in or empty the clock, and there are even, you can do opposing clocks where maybe the clock starts half full of one marker and then half full of another, and every time the players pass a check it will flip one of the other side's markers, and every time the other side passes it'll flip a different marker, and you can use that to create this power balance. And it's a very interesting mechanic, and I really enjoy it. It creates a need for players to act quick without having an hourglass or an alarm set in front of them, which pulls out of the in the moment, out of character thinking, because it can take time for characters to have those in character thoughts. So I personally very much prefer this to like actual timers. The next tool we're going to be talking about is escalation. Escalation is another villain-centric mechanic that is, it's designed to make a villain more threatening actively. The enemy will stay unchanged, but their goal or their means will have adjusted. Things like a character making a deal with an outer world entity and suddenly getting a power boost, or even a character moving up in the ranks and suddenly having access to more goods and more trainers and more ability. Either of these can be escalation, and the difference really does come down to, is the character escalating now, or is it going to be a slow growth of the character? And these are all things that I suggest thinking about when you're choosing them. Much like the GM scene, you should definitely use this sparingly. Not every villain should escalate. Minor bosses should stay as such. You don't want to have every boss in your campaign escalating, otherwise your players will never think the combat is over, even when it is. It doesn't have to be immediate. Character ascending to a throne could be a form of escalation, as now they have the kingdom's resources at their beck and call. That too can be a form of escalation. When a villain escalates, they will get more Ultima points, which are the villain version of Fabula points, and they are spent the exact same way. But villains cannot reclaim Ultima points outside of this. This is the only way they get any more points back. And those are kind of the primary toolkits that a GM has to use. Obviously, there might be toolkits you find in other games that you may want to bring here, and that's perfectly fine. These are just what's in the core book. Now, there's a little bit of difference between running Fabula Ultima and running something like Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons. You see, in those games, while the story is important, combat is such a central focus, where in Fabula, the story is the most important part. The book suggests not running too many dungeons and not being super in-depth and describing, the walls, the floors, this room, which is, yada, yada, yada. They think that dungeons should be a very loose approach where players are basically going room to room to room to room to room. I think a nice middle ground of having a dungeon map is a great way to show the players that there are multiple paths, and it is a dungeon, not just a hallway. And I think that can keep players entertained. You've seen me do it on Fabulous Misfits with the Kane's Trench dungeon, and I think my players really enjoyed it. So it's what I suggest doing to give them something to look at without being a full scale dungeon. The big problem with dungeons is the same kind of problem I had mentioned before, where resting can be an issue. Since the sleeping bag costs 4 inventory points, if you follow my rule of allowing players to split just the cost of that, an average party can get about 6 rests, which is not bad. But you have to remember that sometimes with rolls and such, they may be spending those rests sooner than you might want. One of my big suggestions with Fabula Ultima, and I am aware that the advice I am about to give is the advice that everyone says. But Fabula Ultima is the system that, to my personal opinion, and this is just from the games I've run, this is the game where the yes and approach will push the game furthest. Obviously, there will be moments where you have to say, no, you can't do that, because of the fact that just what the player is trying to do is a little too much. But for the most part, if a player wants to do something that isn't heavily influencing the mechanics, or they want to try something that'll look really cool, go for it. A player's fighting style can be how they want, as long as they aren't doing something in a way that would change the mechanics. If a spellcaster is, wreathing their sword in flame to fire off a fire spell, visually there's nothing wrong with that, as long as they are using the spell accuracy check. If the player has the elementalist spellblade ability, then by all means they would be able to use their accuracy check of the weapon, as long as it's one that the elementalist spellblade ability works with. A guard that the player has used a Fabula point to make their old drinking buddy, I don't see why not. If the player's had, history in this town, maybe they are an old drinking buddy of the guard. That said, that guard may still have burdens that keep them from being able to allow an old drinking buddy to take advantage of their trust. Maybe their family's in danger. Allowing the players to have those changes is perfectly fine. And I say go for it. You can tell such a good story because it is a cooperative game. Let them have fun with it, and saying yes and as often as possible is a great way to run this. And as I said, I know this is like GM 101 is yes and. Just let your players have fun. Go with the rule of cool. There are some systems where the rule of cool is just a little harder to roll with, but in Fabula Ultima things are so loose that why not? I love the freedom that Fabula Ultima provides. It's one of my favorite tabletops for that reason. And I highly suggest just leaning into that. Now, as a GM, you'll be doing your best to set up balanced encounters whenever you can. If you've GM'd other systems, you understand that balance is kind of relative to the party. And if you're a newer GM, or if this can be your first GMing experience, as a brief summary, combat encounters can be different balanced based on several factors: planning, experience, min-maxing, and of course, rolls. I've had times where a perfectly balanced encounter designed to be somewhat challenging, but overcome, it gets overcome after one enemy goes down. I've seen, completely simple encounters turn into total party, and I've seen combat encounters designed to be, deadly. This is going to end with most, if not all, players walking away terribly wounded, turn into a single round victory on the player's side. I've even been the player who's done that to the GM, and to that I say, I am so sorry, you know who you are. Now, every creature in the Corebook is designed to be a soldier rank. The soldiers are just the base rank of character. They're what the party would basically have, where they get one action a turn, unless they have a skill that says otherwise, and they have just basic stats. An elite is 2 soldier characters, and a champion can replace a number of soldiers. So here, you'll notice that we have the Dread Urn. The Dread Urn is a level 5 enemy, as you can see, and as a soldier, it's great for fighting characters that are lower level. It has high defense, but with its vulnerability to physical damage, it is so easy to beat. Unless you're the Fabulous Misfits. they rolled a lot of low rolls. It was kind of crazy. But if you wanted to make it an elite Dreadern, what you do is you double its HP, you increase its initiative by 2, and you give it an NPC skill. There's a difference between NPC skills and class skills, and they are listed in the GM section of the book just before the bestiary. An elite enemy also gets to take 2 actions on their turn instead of 1. So where, a Dreadern can normally either attack or cackle, an elite Dreadern can do both, or it can cackle twice. And then to make a soldier into a champion, it's a lot of the same steps as elites, only you change the double into however much you're replacing enemies. So instead of the hit points being doubled, the the champion that replaces 4 characters is getting quadrupled HP. It's getting only double the mind points, but so for example, a champion Dread Urn replacing 4 urns would have 200 HP instead of 50, 110 magic points, 4 skills that can be NPC, or these ones can be from a class. Champions are able to choose class skills, and then each of its turns it gets to take 4 actions. Considering how much trouble these guys have given, I picture a champion would probably be a bit traumatizing. I should note that for myself. Anyway, so let's say you don't like any of the monsters that are available to you. What options do you have? Well, first off, you can always make adjustments. Chaos Shard is a great base for elemental enemies. You can easily just swap its elemental weaknesses and damages, get equivalent monsters for the varying elements from just those small changes. Maybe a Frost Shard is just a bunch of floating icicles. A Flame Shard is erratic spires of flames that randomly lash out. An Air Shard, hard to see, but the gusts around it make it very clear that it's present. You don't have to use the enemies as is. Even the Corrupt Guards and the Daemon Wolves that I use for Fabulous Misfits are just kind of reskins of enemies that exist in the book. And if that isn't what you're looking for, there's enemy creation. I use this section to make Dortal from episode 7. And the rules are fairly in-depth. It covers different, creature types, human, beast, elemental, and all that. It tells you how many skills they get. They have a 4th option where they get 0 d8s. It's just 2d12 and 2d6. And it covers so much creation that I can't imagine many character designs that wouldn't be able to be used here. You might have something that's beyond your needs. Something to keep in mind is that with the creation section, you can use actual class skills, and don't shy away from doing that if nothing in the book suits what you are looking for. So, there are a few books and such that exist outside of the core book. I say and such because a few of them are just free PDFs on their website, and I'm going to make a quick review of those. First up, the April Fool's bonus, the Ace of Cards. I love the class design and think it's interesting how it's entirely based on the mechanic of drawing cards. It's a bit weird to me that you do need to spend a skill point on their magic card skill to be able to utilize any part of this class, but the concept is novel and I personally am in love with it. The heroic skills are obviously all centered around the Ace of Cards class, and I think the black and white heroic skill probably has the most value to it for any of the ones on the list. The Halloween 2022 special, the Necromancer class, I do love the Necromancer class and all that it adds to the game. The only thing I would worry about is if the campaign is going to feature a lot of undead creatures, there is going to be an issue with getting the grave points, so keep that in mind. The heroic skills are all really nice, with Pulse of the Maggots, which sounds disgusting, probably being one of the stronger ones if you didn't take the Revenant quirk, but otherwise it's a pretty good investment. There's also a boss fight in here, but without using its stat block, I can't really judge it, so I'll leave that to those who have used that boss fight. Winter Holiday Special 2022 is next, with it being a gift from Edgar. This creates an optional forging mechanic that seems really interesting, and it adds some random quality charts that have a bit of variance to them and nothing too obvious. Finally, the Halloween special from 2023, which just adds a few quirks here that have a horror or somber tone to them, something to fit in with that Halloween time. Otherwise, the additions are just a few basic character ideas like you'd find in the core book, showing you builds to start those characters. There is a Game Master booklet that I've only been able to find a PDF version of, which bit weird since it also comes with a GM screen. I'm sure there are physical prints available for it, just when I was looking I could only find PDF versions. The first 15 pages are all excellent tips on handling running a game and various story aspects that may come up. It then goes into ways to use NPCs without having them take up turn order, before coming to a fair number of generators for things like skills for an NPC to use during battle, dangers that could be in areas, or even a more thorough version of the quality generator from Edgar's PDF. I just wanted to get these ones out of the way because we're going to be moving on to the larger supplemental books. These ones are much smaller, with even the GM's master booklet is just a little over 20-ish pages from what I recall. So these next books are going to have a lot more information. The first one we're going to talk about is Alyss High Fantasy, the first one released of the supplemental books. The first thing I want to discuss is that one of the earlier things it adds are locations and how you might design them and keep track of their information. These include the names of those locations, themes within them, how dangerous the areas are, what kind of enemies you may find, what kind of elemental monsters there might be, what kind of dangers may exist, and what kind of discoveries could be something to find for the players when they visit that area. The book gives some great ideas for handling aerial combat, army skirmishes, and colossal enemies before going on to discuss Arcanum. Arcanum, for context, are almost like otherworldly powers and patrons that an arcanist from the core book can utilize for their abilities. The core book has a bunch of different ones that are available to an arcanist, but the High Fantasy Atlas makes clear that if none of them really fit what you need, you can also create your own, and gives two examples of this with the Taurus Arcanum and the Boudica Arcanum. One is designed to just kind of twist one of the abilities, the other one is much more unique in its style. The book also adds a bunch of items, including rare items, which are all very interesting, though they may be a bit different than you were expecting. There's a tail of a chimera for a whip, there's tarot cards that can be thrown, a dancing dress that suits perfectly for armor, and even a drum for a shield that has some fun effects. I love the flavor this book adds, and the classes it adds are no different. It adds the Chanter, Commander, Dancer, and Symbolist class. The Chanter is a bard who specializes in singing music. No reason you wouldn't be able to adjust this to an instrument within Fluff, but primarily it talks about singing the songs. These songs have different abilities like dealing damage, restoring hit points or mind points, or even causing or removing various status effects. The Commander is a martial class whose abilities are all about manipulating the turn order through orders that they give. They have ones that allow people to act out of turn, or even just having their turn immediately next, even if an enemy would be taking their turn next. Thanks to the Queen Gambit skill, you can ultimately wind up attacking, giving an attack to someone, and then giving a turn to someone, which can get a bit overwhelming, so keep that in mind if you do have a commander in your game. The Dancer is, well, a dancer. They have dances that give them varying buffs or hinder enemies, and with the use of their Follow My Lead skill are able to affect their allies as well. The Symbolist adds magic into their writing and paintings, and they have a number of buff and debuff symbols they're able to put, including things that give money when you spend Fabula points, not needing to use inventory points once during a conflict, or even enhancing spells when cast by the person that has the symbol on them. They also have a skill that, when someone has the symbol on them, damage dealt to them can be increased, or healing can be increased to them. It's a really good ability to take if you are a Symbolist. One of my favorite additions to the game, though, by far, zero abilities. These are considerable to limit breaks if you are familiar with like Final Fantasy VII. special abilities that can be activated only once a limit clock has been activated. The zero power has two functions to it: the zero trigger and the zero power. A zero trigger is just what it sounds like. It's something that when this occurs, you fill in sections of your clock, which is a 6-section clock, as mentioned earlier in the Game Master section. It will also fill in whenever you lose hit points that aren't self-inflicted, or whenever you invoke a trait or bond via Fabula points. The trigger fills up on a various amount depending on which trigger you select, and at the end of the scene, the zero clock is emptied, so you can't just save it up from smaller encounters and unleash them on boss fights. The zero powers listed may seem a bit limited, but when you consider what you can do with fluff and how customizable some of them are, they can cover quite a large ground. The book specifies not to let players pick the same zero powers as well as the same zero triggers. I partially think that there's no issue if players choose ones that have similar abilities but are able to be manipulated, such as Zero Scourge, which allows players to deal elemental damage and then add 2 statuses. I think that's acceptable considering that is not going to overlap as much. Now, as with the Necromancer file, I am not as familiar with, the boss fight stats listed in this book as I haven't used them. So I'm going to let people who may have had a chance to utilize them to, take more of an opinion on them. But right off the bat, if you're hurting for a boss fight encounter, the book has plenty to choose from, and just keep in mind that the boss fights are in the level 30 to 40 range. Now, I know this is just a brief overview of the book, but I don't want to go too specific because at the end of the day, I really want people to support this game and go buy the book. So, if you want the specifics of it, you know what to buy. Now, the final book available is the Techno Fantasy Atlas. Much like with the High Fantasy Atlas, it has a specific theme to the book, this one being Techno Fantasy. This book is designed more with a sci-fi setting to it. Something to be techno fantasy has to be more somber, almost. The world of techno fantasy is often filled with oppression, way more than something like a high fantasy world, maybe. Corporations that rule over people like cattle, questionable scientific experiments, magitech designed utilizing the souls of people. Much more common things to be occurring in a techno fantasy setting. Now, the Techno Fantasy Atlas has locations similar to how the High Fantasy Atlas did, but the locations here are obviously designed with technology more in mind. The book also discusses vehicle combat, as you're likely able to be on bikes, cars, ATVs, or even space shuttles doing battle, which is much more common than, say, being on a cart in a high fantasy setting. It is possible, but usually not going to happen. They also give suggestions for ensuring that instead of the magic being so front and center, a lot of it is technologically fit or is just a psychic understanding. It kind of mentions that technology isn't just an option of the world, it's the main focus of the world. Even if technology is heavily utilizing magic to work, it's still technology at the end of the day. And with that in mind, weapons added are much more what you would expect in like sci-fi or cyberpunk games, with things like a grenade launcher, a whip that's basically an electrical cord that can interfere with magitech, and even a sniper rifle for when you just feel like shooting something from a mile away. One of my favorite accessories added is just a spare magazine that lets you reroll an accuracy check with firearms once per scene. I just love the fluff of that. The classes added here are the Pilot, the Mutant, and the Esper. The Esper is a psychic who utilizes psychic gifts that are reactive in nature. The gifts themselves are cool and include things like changing your damage type, buffing it, inflicting statuses, and even restoring hit points or mind points, but a lot of the abilities are based off of when situations happen. The mutant class allows you to adjust natural abilities using therioforms by spending hit points. Therioforms are just another fancy word for mutations, using splicing almost, where you are changing parts of your body with animal DNA. I love the idea of playing a mutant character, hiding your mutations from the party, and just one day in game you're just losing control, and the party sees you, erupting with these claws and this poison and such. I would love to see that interaction happen. The final class is the pilot class. Pilots can gain a vehicle, which can either be a frame, a mech, an exoskeleton. There's quite a few different options. It can even be something as simple as an armored muscle car. Sky is the limit on what you can do with it. There's examples in the book, and I suggest checking them out to maybe get a little bit of inspiration. However, much like the Ace of Cards, you do need to spend one skill point on their personal vehicle skill to have the full unlock of this class. But the customization you can do to these vehicles, it's so worth it. There's a wide array of weapons and support modules, and as I said, frames you can choose from. You could have an entire party of pilots and they could all end up very differently. The Techno Fantasy adds some quirks to liven up the party and give some more variety. And I'm probably going to say this word wrong, Xiphosymbiosis quirk is a bit hard to understand, and some of the quirks can be a bit wordy, though I still enjoy the flavor they add to the game. The big mechanic added in the Techno Fantasy Atlas, though, is Technospheres. Going back to Final Fantasy VII, the easiest way I can explain these is materia. There are two forms of Technospheres, the first one being Nemospheres. These are class abilities. A character is able to, have a Nemosphere that has levels of a class in them, and the Nemospheres are limited up to 5 class levels. But when a Nemosphere reaches level 5, it does gain a heroic skill. The downside is that a player can never equip a Nemosphere that has a skill they have. So that is something to keep in mind when using Nemospheres. The other type of Technosphere is Hoplospheres. Those are extremely more simple. They're basically weapon qualities that can be equipped, and that's kind of it. You can have as many Hoplospheres as slots you have in your weapon, armor, and accessories, which there's a whole chart on how much Zenit you need to spend to have how many spheres. Nemospheres are limited to 2 per equipment, and that is something to keep in mind when deciding which Nemospheres you want to have. And, well, that's it. That's Fabula Ultima at a very broad overview with my own opinions thrown in. My personal thought, I love this game so much. It very quickly climbed the ladder to being one of my favorite tabletop games. It's very freeform with a preference for storytelling, and I think everyone should give this game a shot. You're new to tabletop RPGs, or even if you've been playing for a long time, it's such a great game. And yeah, it won't be for everyone. The lack of social interaction could definitely be a draw for some people, but I think if you get a little creative with it, it might be something you enjoy. Those who have been around long enough know that I've been running a live play called Fabulous Misfits on Twitch and YouTube, alternating Fridays. If you want to see it, just come to the YouTube channel. I do have recap episodes available for watch, as well as I also have the full VODs available to watch as well. It features amazing people. Van from Ventura V. We've got Yoshi from Ophilis. We've got Swifty from Swift Crescendo, and we have Fifth from Ifiwu VT. All of their links will be in the description below, so make sure you go and check them and give them some love as well. Now, thank you everybody so much for watching. I know this video is a lot longer than most of the scripted content I have ever released, and I really do appreciate it. If you're new here, why not drop a subscription? Greatly appreciate it, and you'll be able to come back for all the other fun we get to have. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, and maybe even comment down below some of your favorite Fabula Ultima stories or disagreements you might have with me. I want to hear about the mechanics you love as well. I'm live on Twitch and YouTube, all but Monday and Wednesday, and you can join the Discord down below as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time, and goodbye.